Okay, yeah, so deep subjecthood. So this is kind of a play on deep, right? So it's subjecthood through deep learning, but also playing on this idea of deep subjecthood in linguistics, that you've got a kind of deeper semantic layer of subjecthood in addition to maybe grammatical subjecthood. So we'll get into both of those. This will cover joint work with a bunch of people, including Richard, who's here. And I want to especially highlight Isabel Papadimitriou, who is a grad student at Stanford, who's first author on some of what I will present here. So a kind of big question that I'm interested in asking here is, what can contextual models encode across diverse languages about grammatical role, right? So this is getting at this idea that if you're dealing with fixed embeddings, right, fixed word embeddings, dog will be the same, whether it's an object, whether it's used as an object or an agent, a subject. Whereas the contextual embeddings, right, that can vary, and that might encode some additional piece of meaning, which is useful to you. So today's case study is basically going to be focusing on this category, on this contrast between subjects and objects. I think they're really useful to think about because they're frequent, right? Many sentences have subjects and objects. They're important for meaning. We typically think of them as pretty central for constructing linguistic meaning. And they're both theoretically well researched, right? So there's a lot of theoretical linguistic machinery attempting to explain what's going on with subjecthood and objecthood. But they're also interestingly variable cross-linguistically in ways that we'll talk about. So the kind of broad outline for today is part one, a motivating human experiment. So looking at what do humans know about subjects and objects based on lexical semantics alone. So that's going to be some human study to kind of get us thinking about this question. Then we'll think about, when do fixed word embeddings know which noun is a subject in a transitive sentence. And then move on to contextual/positional embedding. So looking specifically at BERT and then multilingual BERT, thinking about how contextual embeddings might supply syntactic information. And then kind of shifting gears and saying, what can that tell us about subjecthood cross-linguistically? So looking at, if we train a subject-object classifier in one language in multilingual BERT and then transfer it, what might that tell us? Specifically looking at what happens if you train a transitive classifier and then classify intransitive subjects and objects. So part one, this motivating human experiment, how much information do we get from syntactic word order? So this is work from Yev and Ev and Ted and Richard. So yeah, the task here is basically to say, if you were to, in isolation, get a subject, verb, and object, so removing the rest of the sentence context, the rest of the discourse context, and try to figure out of the two nouns, right? So you've got a subject, verb, and object, two nouns, which of those was the subject? Sorry, there's Pogo. If you're trying to guess which of those is the subject, how hard would it be to do that, right? So what we're going to do is extract subjects, verbs, and objects from the universal dependencies corpus, first in English, treat that as ground truth, and then say, okay, which is the subject, which is the object, right? So for the purposes of framing this for participants, we tried things like click on the doer of the action. There are a couple of variants on this, none of which made a huge difference in how people chose. So you can think of it as click on the doer of the action. So if you had the verb chewed and then said dog or bone, which is the doer, you probably have a pretty strong intuition that in this case, the dog is the doer or the agent and bone is the object or the patient. So the experimental setup is to pull out a bunch of these triplets, specifically focusing on transitive and all nominal, so no pronouns. Just to be upfront about that, these are pretty weird sentences, right? This is typically not the way sentences are constructed. We kind of have had a CUNY poster looking at accessibility and preferred argument structure, which basically says that sentences which have both a subject and an object is pretty rare, that the subject and object are both nominal and not pronouns. So I just want to be upfront that these are pretty strange sentences, but I think still informative. And then present about 300 people on Mechanical Turk with the verb and two arguments in random order and ask them which is the doer. Right. So you might kind of think, well, how often do people get that right? If word order is really important for this task, you might expect that it's only like 50-50, right? But that turns out not to be the case. It turns out that there's actually quite a lot of information in just the lexical items, even though in English, these are full nominal phrases, there's no case marking, but it's actually around 90% of the time across these experiments are just kind of basically all slight variations of the same thing. I won't go into detail on that. People get them right? So this is the proportion correct. Each dot is an individual participant. So there are a couple people who maybe we suspect weren't trying very hard at the task, but for the most part, people get about 90% right. Right, this is in English. So there's a potentially interesting comparison to be made to Russian. Right, so Russian has case marking and a freer word order. And so presumably it's the case, oh, I've got some cool blur effect unintentionally happening there. So presumably it's the case, oh, the whole slide's gonna be blurred, okay. Okay, right, so presumably it's the case that Russian has freer word order, or it does have freer word order. So you might expect that, well, because the word order is freer, there's going to be less information in the word order. And so maybe the test should be easier because you're going to have more information in the actual words themselves. Right, but that turns out not to be the case. Russian looks pretty similar, actually, to English, even though it's got freer word order in case. It's slightly lower, but kind of well within noise. About 90% of the time, people are getting these tests right. Right, and I don't think this result is especially surprising. This is kind of just quantifying something you probably have an intuition for, which is that a lot of sentences, which are simple transitive subject verb object sentences, are really pretty easy, right? So like people had pets, Hurricane Rita packed wins, people accept ideas, lion ate game, right? It's kind of, game ate lion kind of would be pretty implausible, right? But what's interesting is there's this tail of sentences where it actually does turn out to be the case that if you were to try to go just based on lexical items, you might get things wrong, right? So if you had, these are real sentences from the corpus, and this is the tree bank, the EWT tree bank, so there are lots of kind of these kind of newsy politics sentences from that particular era, right? So decades left Bush, your email mentioned Judy, Musharraf told Clinton. Right, so decades left Bush, you've got this agent Bush, but actually the sentence is something like the decades left Bush, worse for the wear. Right, and you've got this agent seeming word Judy, and you might think this Judy mentioned your email, but it's actually your email mentioned Judy. And then here you get into kind of interesting questions of kind of societal biases, right? In that there seems to be maybe some bias that someone like Clinton, who's the kind of more prominent familiar figure to the US audience who was doing the task, picks Clinton like almost universally as the agent here, even though in this case it's actually the object, which are told Clinton, right? So people struggle when the subject is inanimate and the object is animate is another way, right? We can actually quantify that. So if we look at those and look at accuracy broken down by animacy of the two nominals, the easy ones, the easiest one is this kind of pretty expected case when you've got an animate subject and inanimate object. Another kind of easy case is when both are inanimate. That seems to be pretty restricted. But the difficult cases are when you've got the kind of reverse of the expectation, right? So your email mentioned Judy cases, where it's actually the object which is animate. And then it turns out that subjects and objects both being animate also tend to be kind of hard. Probably because these tend to be the most reversible kind of sentences, right? Like Musharraf told Clinton or Clinton told Musharraf. So to summarize that human bit, right, in English and Russian, people can identify subjects in these subject verb object triplets. There seems like there's lots of information in the lexical items alone, right? So we can then ask, well, are English and Russian representative, or are they kind of special or unusual in some way? And so to get at that, we could run this in 30 different languages. That would be kind of hard and costly. We'd have to get participants from all those places. So instead, an easier idea is maybe, well, let's do that with fast text embeddings and do this computationally and say, can we computationally train a little model to say, when given a subject, verb, and object, which one is the subject? So the task here is to get fast text embeddings, right? So these are embeddings trained on Wikipedia across a variety of languages. We basically just concatenate together the embeddings for the subject, verb, and objects, dog, bone, and chewed, and then vary at test time, vary the order in which the subject and the object appear, and then ask the classifier to tell you whether the subject came first or the object came first. So basically just perform a classification task by putting a little neural network on top of it, and then outputting whether the first token is the subject or the object. Right, so this is basically asking the model to do the same thing we asked humans to do. And it turns out that the model does just about as well. So it's really pretty similar in both English and Russian to what humans did. So here, experiment 2 here is the Russian one. So the blue is Russian, the red is English. Looks pretty similar, right? Accuracy is still 85 to 90% kind of range. And then if we extend that to a whole bunch more languages from the universal dependencies corpus, again, by and large, things look pretty similar. So 80 to 90% accuracy. There's kind of probably some expected variation based on things like corpus size. The worst performing classifiers happen in Chinese, and it's possible something is going on there with the tokenization or things like that. Right, but by and large, it looks pretty similar to what the human performance looks like. And so this is in some ways not a surprising result, but in other ways it's kind of interesting, right? That in only about 10 to 20% of sentences, do you actually need to know, or potentially need to know syntax and know something about the word order in order to know who did what to whom, in order to know which was the subject and which was the object, right? And that basically is a way to say that, well, based on the fixed embeddings, right? So if you are thinking computationally, based on the fixed embeddings from a model, those basically do really well. So you might say, well, do we not really need contextual embeddings to do a task like this? Or that we don't need context more generally to encode something like this kind of simple syntactic information? And maybe I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for part 2, and we'll call that the end of part 1.